So I forget whether it was Lewis or Clark, but getting to the Camas Prairie and thinking that they had reached the Pacific Ocean. And like the deception was so complete that at first I thought it was water. I don't know why, like it just line like jumped out of the diaries like a line of poetry for me. So when I encounter those Camas Prairies, it's all of these things, right? It's Lewis and Clark. It's the time that I spent with the Nez Perce tribe, the history of Chinese Americans in Idaho. So I think when it comes to all of that, I've just sort of been like less and less interested with like, well, what do we call the plants? And more interested in like other kinds of storytelling.
Hey, this is Treehugger Podcast. I am Michael Yadrick, your host, and I am broadcasting from Tacoma, Washington, aka Grit City, and the native land of the Puyallup tribe and Steilacoom people. This is the show where we reimagine ecological restoration. I want to situate this episode a bit before we launch. If you jump into our Wayback Podcast machine, one will find episode 5 about forest bathing. Remember that one? I do. And one specific thing relevant to today's discussion that happened in that episode with eco-spiritual guide, author, and designer Julia Plevin. To provide a bit of a primer before I play the clip, I have been in the weeds, literally and figuratively, for years. Now in my day job, people trust me and my team to restore urban nature. In performing that role, I blamed weeds for the downfall of biodiversity and considered them largely a threat to a healthy environment for years. This was an unhealthy mistake. Creeping into my personal life, I couldn't totally enjoy a walk in the woods with my family and friends without getting bent out of shape about the weeds I saw that I think didn't belong. I spend a good amount of time outside, so this shapes my well-being and the quality of my experience in wider nature.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing and your heart and soul that you put into it. And I've been thinking this whole talk, I have one invitation for you.
For me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is when you are in the forest, maybe take a moment to take off your work hat and wonder, inquire if these invasive species, like maybe just ask or like try to get in touch. Like what is the role of these invasive species? What message might they have to share for you? Right. I definitely don't have the answer, but I just felt that there was something there for you. It's an interesting kind of like quagmire of where are we putting our own judgment on and where are we actually being a beneficial part of the process. So just an interesting hole to dive into. Yes. Maybe something that could come up from it.
All right. We could workshop this, I think. The remote audio was a bit garbled, but Julia offers, what is the role of these invasive species? What message might they have to share for you? That invitation has been on my mind a lot since the waning days of 2019. I often think about it when I enter a forest on a walk or a hike. It also erupts spontaneously and ever more intentionally at work. So this is a cool way to show some continuity of themes in the podcast, and I wanted to remember that with you all and remind myself of that invitation from Julia several years ago. Funny, because all of this has come true. I have dived deep into a hole about this topic and flashed forward to last year's Words About Weeds episode that was part of a workshop focused on applying a lens of identity, diversity, and justice to the language of ecology. Here's a snippet of that episode featuring my comrade Celeste Williams.
Some scholars have also questioned the ethics of invasive language that can justify polarizing and aggressive eradication programs in a society where we're trying to promote multiculturalism and unity. So I'm aiming to just continue these conversations about language around invasive species and demonstrate how words can amplify negative perceptions, reawaken prejudices, and justify military actions, whether plant, animal, pathogen, or human.
If you take time to look, there's a growing underflow of writing and thought that is surfacing and grinds against the dominant thinking about how we not only talk about, but treat our more than human relations. And that brings us to the introduction of Jenny Liou, my guest on this episode. Jenny is an English professor at Pierce College and an avid naturalist and ecological restorationist. She likes thinking and writing about bodies of thought, the mineral body of the loess-covered plains where she grew up, bodies of water, the rivers along whose banks she has explored the Pacific Northwest and her family's history in China, the body of the Pacific which divides her from that part of her family. She lives and writes near that ocean in Tacoma, Washington. Back in the summer of 2020, Jenny wrote an epic article in the High Country News titled, "Am I an Invasive Species?" In the essay, she likens the campaign against Asian giant hornets purportedly invading the U.S. to the racial attitudes about the COVID-19 pandemic. Then a few months back, fortuitously, Jenny pops up on my radars again, making a presentation to Washington Native Plant Society focused on the rhetoric bending related to genus rubus, as well as discussing the parallels between human immigration and invasive plant management strategies. Both article and presentation are linked in the show notes. Luckily, she moved just across town from me in the South Sound, so we sat down in person at Treehugger Studios /Yadrick Family Room for a chat, which on the surface is about our relationship with weeds, but it went much deeper than expected. So about 10 minutes into the conversation, Jenny is diving deep, swimming far. I mean, like she's like swimming freestyle. I am like swimming backstroke. I can't even see her. She was blowing my mind about a body of thought called biopolitics and unpacking systems that have been built to protect some forms of life and not other forms of life. Talking about how who decides who gets excluded as politics and law evaluates life, what happens to those people and more than human who get excluded. So Jenny has this unique perspective for us to rethink species invasions because she weaves in some thoughts on political economy, identity, stories from home, and talk about belonging. We geek out about plants, all the things. For me, talking about these issues brings some uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, since much of my career has focused on forwarding the most efficient and effective ways to eradicate invasive species from the land. Honestly, I'm still navigating all the associated feelings and new vocabulary, and that is why I'm grateful to bring in backup like Jenny Liou. It starts right here. Enjoy the conversation.
I'm Jenny Liou. I teach English at Pierce College, and I write a lot about race and environmentalism. I grew up mostly in rural Idaho. We actually moved to Idaho from outside of Philadelphia because my parents were getting harassed for being a biracial couple. And so we ended up in the wilderness of Idaho. And I guess in that sense, I've always thought about race and environmentalism in the same breath. So I guess it makes sense that that's what I work on now.
Wow. I don't know. I make this generalization or stereotype about Idaho as being not super inviting to biracial couples either, but I don't know.
Oh, that would be totally correct. Definitely an out of the frying pan into the fire sort of thing. My dad is a hydraulic engineer. And so when he came to the States, I don't know how this was arranged, but he ended up coming to the United States for his master's degree before going to Michigan for his PhD and then finding his way to work in Pennsylvania. And his brother actually got sick and ended up dying. So he went back to Taiwan for the funeral, and his company ransacked his office and accused him of stealing trade secrets to bring them back to China and all sorts of crazy stuff. And so the University of Idaho, they knew him and they liked his work, so they offered him a position. It doesn't seem like it would be better. Just grew up at the threshold of the wilderness. My parents live about 5 miles outside of Moscow. Okay. So it very much is sort of like a hobby farm situation. They have enough land and it sort of abuts slightly wilder land. So it was enough to kind of grow up feeling a connection to nature, and then got into backpacking and all sorts of stuff pretty early in life too.
Thanks so much. I knew of you. I read a couple articles that you wrote, but for some reason I never thought that you lived even close to me. So I was very pleasantly surprised that you actually moved to town recently.
Yeah, it's actually really recent. I just moved to Tacoma at the end of October. Yeah, so
nice. You liking it so far? Is there more of a Tacoma story?
You know, I'm not sure I have a really exciting Tacoma story. It wasn't actually a very exciting move. I actually have a lot of coworkers that live in Tacoma already, so it was kind of enticing. And then one of my best friends was like, Jenny, let's buy houses in Tacoma. And so like my husband and I got on board and we're like, okay. And she's like, here's my realtor's number. Let's do it. And so we contacted the realtor, went to look at houses, found one we liked, and then bought one. She was like, oh, now?
We did it. You're to move forward. Nice.
So yeah, like I guess we're like really like just action-oriented people. So she never moved to Tacoma, but here we are, and we're like very glad that someone lit a fire under us to move our family down here. It's been mostly COVID times, so we haven't probably experienced all of Tacoma.
We've unmasked, I guess, a couple days ago, and we're in phase 4 right now, I guess.
We'll see if it holds.
This is actually a great beginning to a story from your article, if you're okay with me reading your words back to you.
Oh, sure.
So, quote, unquote, I went to college, and as I learned more about ecology, I started seeing threats everywhere. So this is like, me too, to a certain extent. Do you feel like this is programmed into us from a formal education? To kind of see threats. I guess from my perspective too, I talk like to my, I'll say normal friends, like, that aren't kind of ecology buffs. They're just like, what are you so bent out of shape about? What are these threats you talk about?
I'm not sure I would use the word programmed. I know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And I guess my first thought when you asked that is I'm thinking about how times have changed. Actually, as we speak right now, I'm a University of Washington graduate student once again. I don't know why that's what I thought I needed in my life, but after having most of my advanced education in the humanities, but working in the green humanities, I wanted to have some firsthand knowledge of that again. So it's been really interesting to see what has changed and what remains the same. And it's gotten me thinking about the whiteness of ecology as a discipline. And I feel like the way that it is taught, at least in some parts of, at least in some parts of graduate school, as I've re-experienced it, the way that it's taught has changed a lot. But the conversations remain largely the same. And I think that might have to do with the socioeconomics, the demographics, whatever you want to call it, of the people who decide that they want to become environmental scientists or natural resource managers. I think there's already something that far precedes the education we get in college that kind of determines how people are going to think about nature and their relation to it. So I don't know, I guess. I think there's been this sort of effort to just sort of intervene in that, if anything, in higher education these days, at least amongst some practitioners, right? I think there are people who are kind of teaching things the same way they used to, but there are people who are asking for this much more transdisciplinary and I would say sort of culturally inflected kind of activist view. And I love that, but I'm not sure that makes a difference to the majority of the people versus, I think the attitude might be there's science, and then there's this other thing that I have to know, but it's not as important as the science. And I think that's a sort of broader cultural hierarchy.
I gotcha.
So I don't know how you change that.
Yeah, I know. I think you can change words. And recently, we did an episode last year-ish about just language, about changing our language associated with how we talk about plants. But the real invitation I feel like I received from this collaboration of folks that I've been hanging out with, particularly Celeste and Lisa, our West Coast contingent, was really more of an invitation to treat invasive plants or weeds with more respect and humility. And that's what I've been navigating, because we could change our language, but really to a certain extent with in restoration ecology, invasion ecology anyway, we're still trying to eradicate things and control things and really manage nature to a certain extent. So just change our language is just almost political correctness, I guess, to a certain extent.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think we need something more than a language shift. It's a very large paradigm shift is what seems like is needed here. I think language can sometimes drive that. as long as we don't fall into the trap of asking, well, like, what's the synonym? What's the PC synonym? And when we just go looking for the next word to use for the same meaning, I don't think that helps us make progress. But I think what happens with plants is really interesting. And most of my recent ecological work has not actually been with plants. It's mostly been with salmon. So the fact that what I've spent my days doing has been salmon snorkel surveys and topographical surveys and making sense of those things all together. But then when it comes time to write about how we use language, I'm talking about plants.
Yeah.
I think if I take a step back from my own practices in a way that I hadn't really thought about until you asked that question, maybe the way we talk about plants might be particularly problematic because they seem further from consciousness or further from humanness than some other species. And I think there's been a trend in the literature, like I think a trend in philosophy as well, not just in this cordoned off environmental zone, thinking about animism and the ways in which experience accretes onto all sorts of things, human, otherwise, quote unquote, alive or otherwise. And so I think that's part of what's finding our way into our conversation here is that if we take a look at the way that we think about everything, maybe we find some of the biggest problems with how we think and talk about plants, which we assumed were inanimate, but very much alive. If I were to go down a very boring tangent here, it would probably involve Agamben, and he talks a lot about, right? So, and this is where I'm just sort of like, oh my gosh, I never know, like there's no forum in which people want to talk about Agamben and plants all at once. Even like there's this burgeoning field of critical physical geography, and people have a few pet philosophers or pet critical theorists, like they love to talk about Foucault, I think, because there's some very natural connections there between his concept of biopower and the ways that we want to manipulate natural environments. Agamben, though, talks a lot about, well, maybe people don't want to talk about him because maybe it's more problematic in terms of our interface with nature, right? Because he talks about states of exception and states of emergency. I think very few people think about Agamben and nature side by side. Yeah. But if we were thinking about like, okay, like what do we do with this whole world of things that are alive but are not sentient, right? And so for Agamben, he splits it into zoe, just sort of like teeming life, and then the bios politikos, or like biological life as a sort of political structure, and then talks about the ways in which those things interface, and it ends up being a sort of scary story about the way that you get controlled if you are sort of excluded from the political hierarchy, but very much still alive, but open to persecution because you're not protected under the law as we know it, right? So I think that's what's been really interesting to me, is thinking about like, okay, we have all sorts of environmental legislation. We have all sorts of things that we do to protect the parts of the environment that we've decided to protect. I think some of them are actually problematic and infringe upon a lot of indigenous rights. So I think it's like a hard zone to be in once you start asking those questions, especially as environmentalists. We have environmentalist friends and a whole environmentalist culture, and it's easy to be a turncoat when you start asking those questions, right?
Right.
But what is it that we make of this system that has been built to protect some forms of life and not other forms of life? How do we decide who gets excluded? What happens to those people who get excluded? And Agamben writes a lot about how, like, well, there's this certain category of life. He's basically pointing out human life that gets relegated to this sort of exempt status. And he's like, well, there's some human statuses where you can kill those people and nothing happens to you, right? So if we kind of extend the line of thinking to the whole of living nature, right? Where are those places where you can do like great harm and nothing happens to you? Because we've come up with this political and philosophical framework in which we're not going to count that thing as alive, or that thing has somehow transgressed something, so they've lost the rights of personhood broadly applied to sometimes non-human persons. That sounds like a contradiction, and there's a whole other body of theory to unpack there. Yeah. But if we started thinking about what we consider personhood and attributing it to things like a river or a geological system, I think that opens up a whole new set of questions. So I'm really interested in that, which actually makes it kind of hard to converse with even a lot of other environmental theorists, because we tend to find that we're bringing really different bodies of theory to the work.
I love that perspective. I'm not quite following you, but I am trying. I wanted to jump in for a second because there's different things that sort of resonated with me. You said turncoat, but I say like kind of like a traitor, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Like I feel like a traitor, like I'm a tree hugger, or there's this machismo associated with killing weeds and planting trees and managing nature. What's a gumbum? A gumbum is like
a gomban.
A gomban.
Did you want me to spell that?
No, I mean, yeah, sure. Yeah, do
it. Agamben. I feel like I'm in a spelling bee. He writes a lot about states of emergency in ways that I think are so interesting. And I'm like, in the age of COVID, why aren't all the theorists reading Agamben, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, he writes about what's happening now, you know, when you take normal rules and stuff and suspend them because there's a state of emergency and then something else has to happen. Like you have like water management sort of program and things are going to happen according to the schedule. And we're going to like lift the gates and let water in at this time. And then you end up with some wild drought or something and the fish are dying. And when do you decide, or when do the policymakers decide to break the rules to like go salvage those fish, let extra water in, break down a dam so that fish have a more direct way of getting out of a tributary, right? Like all of these questions about what the exceptions to environmental policy. Side plug, I wish that there were a new and burgeoning field of people studying Agamben and environmentalism.
I can imagine those scenarios that come up that are just beyond the dominant paradigm, or they're just, we can't expect this to happen, but it happens, and then
what do you do?
What do we do?
Like, when the whole system of how you thought about something seems like it doesn't apply in that moment. And then how do you go back from that, like once it's over, right?
So a lot of people think of like the term of resilience, and we're supposed to like just bounce back to the previous state, right, of like normalcy. But we've crossed perhaps a threshold and like it's like a new tomorrow, or...
Yeah, I kind of hate that word. I mean, I guess the word resilience gets used in a lot of different ways.
Thank you very much. I have issues with it too. I was going to use air quotes.
What are your issues with it?
I think it's overused almost to the point where it sort of lacks meaning, especially with climate resiliency, right? Maybe we just lack vocabulary to deal with the climate emergency. So we say resiliency, but we mean something else. Maybe we think like mitigation, or when we should be thinking about adaptation, but it's just not all resiliency.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think part of what really gets me there is the way when people talk about resiliency, oftentimes it seems like sort of hedging your bets. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And if a system is more resilient, it's more complex. So let's do all of these different things. And, I think this kind of ties into something bigger that bothers me. Sometimes there is like one like really obvious answer, and then I feel like it's kind of fiddling while Rome burns if we're like doing all these little things and like following through with this theory. And I'm like, well, climate change is a really big one, right? And I think this is another area where people are kind of like traitor because, like I used to live in California. I went from Idaho down to California for school, moved there in 2000. And I think that was still an era where climate change was on all of our radar, and climate change was on some of our radar. And some of us worried very much about what was going to happen in the future, but it was not in the public discourse in this way. And it hadn't soaked into like what we did even in like ecological restoration and those communities where people like believed that science. But I still remember like just going out to find like hydrobiid snails, like endemic populations of snails and endemic populations of orchids, and just like really just falling in love with like that whole world of these elusive, rare, native things, And I should say, going along with that, I just was such an avid naturalist. I learned the name of every plant and every animal, and people were like, "What are you doing this weekend?" And I'd be like, "Oh, hiking like some path from like here to some other city, like through these little like edges of nature and learning every plant I see along the way," right? That kind of thing. And then I moved up here, and by the time I was here, I was like, someone needs to get some actual legislation in place that's going to change climate, that's going to do something to global warming. And I'm no longer very convinced at all that planting a few native species or weeding out a few quote-unquote invasives has any relevance to the biggest things facing any of us today. But then I think once you're in the realm of environmental policy, so this is part of why I went back to school. Once I realized that, I was like, I learned the wrong things. I want to learn environmental policy. I want to learn how to make a difference. And then I took all these environmental policy classes, and I was kind of like, wait, this is what we're doing? Like, this is the response. Like, this is how environmentalists want to change this. And I guess I went into that experience not really knowing very much about, like, I thought I understood, like, how politics worked in our country, but I didn't, right? I didn't understand just the sort of stability and slow movingness of how anything works. Like, I guess I thought there was more room for activism. Like, just filled with this deep dread that for a long time, or I went through a phase where I was like, oh, political action is the only path to change. It seems another case of hedging our bets and making these tiny incremental changes that do not line up with the sort of global clock of what is happening at all.
Yeah, and I had another podcast episode a while back, and I just revisited with them, Maya Van Rossum and her daughter. They're very much activists in anti-fossil fuels mostly, I guess, but a whole range of things, water protectors as well. And just we don't have really rights to a clean environment, and really just a lot of environmental policy is just about permitting. Like, it's called a permit for a reason, right? They're just permitting like a warehouse in South Tacoma or like, things like that.
Absolutely. And I actually worked as an environmental consultant for a while. And maybe that's part of where my current disillusionment with native plants comes from. Like, even if it's like one house with one decision to make, that individual landowner is going to be like, soft armoring, why would I do that? Like, I want to extend my land all the way to the waterfront, like have a hard seawall, and like, can't you work this out so I can just like plant some native plants on the side? Or like, and I'm just like, I don't think that like planting 5 kinnikinnick plants is like really going to like affect the situation. And then all this sort of bartering happens, I mean, I'm not a fan of a lot of the things that the Army Corps does, but they're actually good about being somewhat rigorous about this. But a lot of counties will engage in this like very odd sort of like small stakes bartering about like planting plans and stuff. So I deeply question that category of a native plant to begin with. But then the fact that those plants have become very small bartering chips in a system that ultimately continues to enable some very problematic patterns of development.
This is a question I had earlier on. Yeah, like, what is a native plant? I've been reading more like some stuff from historical ecologists and just thinking about what we think and how we've been taught, or like when we first started to distinguish between a native plant and what doesn't belong, and like the Nancy Turner ethnobotany sort of perspective. I mean, there's a lot of plants that environmentalists think this area was covered in a glacier, and then the glacier retreated, and then the plants just started their march back northward, and the animals dropped the seeds, and that's how the plants got here. But to a certain extent, like, people were very much involved in dozens and dozens of plants that people actively move for like thousands and thousands of years. And so the conception of like, when do you draw that line of like native versus like something that was introduced is pretty arbitrary. And then thinking about like what we call an invasive plant as its founding, I think like in the 1950s or World War II era, like the Charles Elton era.
Yeah. So. I mean, but what springs immediately to mind is that invasive plants became a thing the same time that our country put Japanese Americans into internment camps, right? This whole rhetoric of there's this enemy amongst us and we didn't know it until now, but all of a sudden we know it and we have to exterminate it, right? So I guess for me, those things always go hand in hand. So the concept of an invasive plant, I think, is very problematic. And the concept of a native plant, I mean, I think, probably we're reading a lot of the same things about this. And I think the closest I can come to the definition that works for me, but this is also a sort of contradiction in my mind, is thinking about native plants and the sort of line that maybe we could draw between those sort of like quote unquote natural, like human environmental interactions and what's happening now. I guess it might be, the sort of acceleration of globalization. Usually we look at the sort of industrial revolution as the beginning of that and saying like, that's the same line we draw elsewhere when it comes to environmental stuff. This is where we start talking about these like escalating human activities that have caused a new kind of harm and perhaps really tipped the scale. I think it's a fuzzier line than some people do, perhaps. But somewhere in the midst of that, is if it were reasonable at all to sort of draw a dividing line and say maybe this is when there's an outsized effect of human transportation of invasive species, then the other part of my brain rebels against that because, of course, that also aligns with our country's immigration history.
So it applies to plants and people arising from the same place almost. I was actually thinking about, I could show you something very personal to me. It's like we moved in here about 6.5 years ago. I don't know if you know of Tree of Heaven. Are you familiar with that plant? Allianthus altissima.
Oh, okay.
Have you ever heard of it? It's like tree grows in Brooklyn. It actually, there's one right outside the door. We bought this place and like I had no idea what it was. I just thought it was like a big walnut, but they had cleaned, they'd sort of tidied up. And so the landscape was like super tidy. I had no idea what it was, but it is one of these species that's like really villainized. And there's been this recent blow up because it's a host for a spotted lanternfly, which is actually, it seems like mostly likes to eat hops and grapes. So the state is essentially mobilizing against spotted lanternfly. Nobody likes to fuck with our like beer and wine, in Washington state. So I think that's the biggest threat from spotted lanternfly at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, but like, what are you supposed to do? Like, chop your tree down? I mean, like, maybe, but I feel like that just comes into like conflict with this other thing, right? Which is when we're talking about just sort of local responses to these heat waves and stuff, like,
exactly,
keep that vegetation growing. And I've been like so curious about what this response is going to look like on a broad scale, right? Like, because if we need trees in a hurry, this is part of how we've ended up with so many quote unquote invasive plants in America, right?
Yeah.
Like, what can I have here that's going to grow right away?
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's not a native species. So I don't really know what the ethics of that will look like, but it seems really likely to me that this rapid vegetation that seems like a likely response to these heat wave emergencies is going to involve a reckoning where people are going to need to decide whether they value nativeness or whether they value something that is going to grow like crazy and provide that kind of rapid shade.
Yeah, and they measure that generally via canopy cover, right? And like Tacoma has like one of the lowest canopy covers of any city in the megalopolis Puget Sound, really. I think they measure it in percent, right? Kind of looking down on it. And so it's like 20% versus Seattle, that's 30%. And then I think maybe you think of some other leafy green communities. Some other cities might be up around 40%, which is like a pretty nice threshold, I guess, what the science says, and when you actually start to see cooling from shade and stuff. So, but I think the only thing that really keeps us cool here is the proximity to water and the trees, really. So the city goal, again, like for environmental policy perspective, is like we want 30% in the city, but like going from 20% to 30% is like, it's like this much. It's like this much, right?
Yeah.
It's so much planting, and then conflict potentially is like providing or building lots more housing for all the people. It kind of comes in conflict with preservation of mature trees. That's what it looks like on the ground anyway, like from the tree advocate's perspective.
Yeah, so how do you advocate differently for trees that provide that canopy cover but are quote unquote exotic and bring with them this host of other issues?
So I had some email interaction about this because they were like, find all your tree of heavens, like in city of Seattle anyway. So my day job was like, we need to survey for all the tree of heaven in the entire city and monitor for spotted lanternfly. And so essentially it's like eradicate or extinct all the tree of heaven because it could be home for a spotted lanternfly. Maybe couched in terms of like quality tree cover or healthy tree cover was the term they used. I was like, and I know what they were saying, but at the same time, I was like, well, that's so twisted. Yeah, because again, I have this gigantic tree of heaven outside my door that I live with every day. So it's complicated.
I think like the poet part of my brain is thinking there's got to be like some sort of story here. It's such a evocative name for a tree.
Yeah, and common names are complicated anyway. I do know it was written into this book. Yeah, this tree grows in Brooklyn, which is a pretty thick book. because it's like nature in the city and it grows anywhere. It grows out of cracks.
Oh, I think, getting back to something I was saying earlier, like when I was in California, I was like a really avid naturalist. I moved down there. I was like, I'm going to like figure out like how to belong to this place. I'm going to learn everything. And then by the time I moved up to Washington again, to some degree it was coming home. I grew up 5 hours away from here. But on the other hand, when I moved back, I think at that point I was just sort of like, like, I'm not sure that this knowledge of individual species is the answer, at least for me. So I've actually had a lot of anxiety lately because I'm like, most of the plants here I can identify by family or perhaps by genus, because I've like taken a bunch of plant systematics classes. But I am a terrible Pacific Northwest naturalist.
Really?
Like terrible. I mean, but yeah, again, genus, maybe on a good day.
Good.
You know?
That's still pretty good. To a certain extent, there's some mystery in it then too, I guess, right? Like you don't need that level of Linnaean knowing the Latin names of things. You can just like appreciate it just for being green.
It might be a more complicated rabbit hole than that. I think to some degree, I'm like, oh, okay, this has been a slow renunciation of all of the things that I used to love, right? Like one of my first jobs when I went to college was working for the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UC Irvine. So I was making a database. It was the beginning of like the digital age or whatever. So I was just scanning like carousel after carousel of slides for like every professor in the department. And it was such a cool activity because I got to just sit down with people and hear these stories of their whole careers, and they would just tell me like the names of some of the plants or animals or whatever, and I wasn't that skilled of a taxonomist at that point, because I was just a 17-year-old who thought science was cool. But then in that process, like I had to enter every single plant, the ones they had identified and talked about, but also everything else that showed up in a slide, every single plant at every single taxonomic level. And for me, it took a long time to figure it out, but it really gave me the opportunity to become like a skilled taxonomic biologist in a way that I think most people wouldn't have as part of their educational pathway. And I loved it. I think probably with the same part of my brain that loves poetry. It felt like this sort of like web of understanding that encompassed everything. And it kind of took a lot to get to the point of rejecting that. But I think I reject it now. It seems to be part and parcel of the sort of colonial mind control of nature and fitting everything into that system. And, I think the beginnings of that sort of web coming apart for me would probably be using genetic information to revise taxonomies, right? And so I think that made a lot of us suddenly question, like, oh, so if we were doing all of this, like, on the basis of morphology, how does that align with, say, our country's long and problematic history of, like, physiognomy, right? Yes. This idea of, like, sort of classifying, like, oftentimes racial characteristics on the basis of, like, their physical conformation and stuff like that. And so for a while, I was like, oh, well, let's just get everything sorted out at a molecular level and decide what belongs where. But then I think that also opens the door to a whole bunch of other problems. Again, kind of in search of this totalizing knowledge of what the world is and how it sorts out. So I think the desire to know the world in that way is something that I think all of us feel that temptation. I used to like lean into it, and now I think I maybe try to curtail it in myself, which I think to some people maybe looks like willful ignorance. And I guess it is. Perhaps it is willful ignorance of or a rejection of that way of thought, because I think it's like it comes from a place where you believe that one way of knowing nature is the only way of knowing nature. Exactly. Yeah. So I don't know. That's not useful, because then I'm like, well, how do we call anything by any name? Welcome to my philosophical conundrum.
There's so many names for different plants, right? Because there's the first names for things too, right? And that can be somewhat varied because of living in Coast Salish territory, like. For Kinnickinnick, actually, I just saw it the other day. It was on a sign at the Duwamish Longhouse. I don't know where Kinnickinnick comes from, but Kuyu is great to have that language, that access to that other name too, because we're kind of bilingual. A lot of us are kind of bilingual, or we have that ability to access that part of our brain to name things differently, I guess. Or language is dynamic, right? So it's okay to have we can fit in another name in our head for things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, like, to me, that is so important. And I think one of the things that sort of forced a good crisis in my way of thinking was that my first job out of grad school was teaching at Northwest Indian College. So I showed up there like, anyone want to learn about Shakespeare, without it really like a full understanding of why no one at an Indigenous college wanted to learn about Shakespeare.
No.
And then I think once I kind of worked there for a while and really just had this immersion in this completely different way of knowing the world, it changed me a lot as a teacher, as a thinker, as a writer. I don't know, because I think I'm still someone who will hesitate to, this is going to sound terrible. I feel like I'm someone who will maybe hesitate to use the indigenous word for a plant, because there's a part of me that feels like, oh, I need to do that, and like no way to honor the plant except to do that. And there's another part of me that feels like such a poser.
No.
Not my word for the plant.
Yeah,
but then
exactly.
if I also reject the sort of colonial name for the plant, I'm like, what is my name for the plant?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually kind of like where a lot of my work right now is coming from. And you know, a lot of my writing, it's spawned these conversations with people who are like, you know, there's a lot of discourses, Robin Wall Kimmerer, for example. What would it mean to become Indigenous? I think people choose to misread that essay, and she's kind of saying you can't fully become Indigenous, but you can do these other things to improve your land ethic, right? But people still have some desire or some myth to, like, you know, become indigenous dwellers on the land in some sense. And I think maybe coming to this conversation, not just like as a white American with a sort of like nostalgia for a history that isn't really mine, you know, but coming as biracial, half immigrant with this like really fragmented relation to the land to begin with, those myths, I guess, don't really call to me, or maybe they don't call to me anymore, right? Like I'm much more interested in these questions of like, well, what is the proper way to dwell on land that is not yours? You know, which name do you choose for things when none of the names are the names that like apply to your own culture?
Yeah. Right. No, that can be problematic. I think some of it is honoring the people that have been here and having them just acknowledging that we have put this random ass name on a plant that they've had names for forever, right? I read a little bit of Kim Tallbear.
Oh, yeah,
He talks about the problematic things about how settlers try to indigenize themselves to a certain extent and playing like cowboy and Indian. And that now we're settled here, but we're not. We're still can have this mobility at any point in time. A lot of us to move around, to call ourselves or to somehow indigenize ourselves comes with a lot of still continued erasure of First Peoples of a place.
I think right now we're getting at something that's been like troubling me the most, I guess, at this point in my thinking. It's just like, well, how do these different bodies of thought even kind of interact with each other? And I guess the way that this has been sort of playing out in my life, I think you mentioned early on, you're like, Idaho, that doesn't seem like a great place to not be white, right? And it's not. And one of the side effects of growing up in Idaho looking the way that I do is that everyone thinks that I am indigenous. They're on Nimipu land, right? Okay. So it's so much more common to like encounter a part of the Nez Perce tribe than to encounter like a half white, half Chinese person. So I've kind of like grown up with that. Like, you know, like people having conversations with me about like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like that, you know, and then be like, oh, like now that I like understand those dynamics, I'm like, it would be so easy. And even like working, you know, I worked for Northwest Indian College on the Nez Perce Reservation. I worked for Nez Perce tribal fisheries. And I think there is very much, and I mean, people will say it explicitly sometimes of like, oh, well, you know, like you're Asian and that's like, you know, you're like our sister. It's like, oh, there's this weird door that's partway open sometimes on that end. Like I haven't felt like resistance, like, no, don't be indigenous, you're a poser. Okay. I think that this comes from me, right? Like, anyways, the way that I've been sort of thinking about this is that when I worked for Northwest Indian College, I got to work on a few occasions with a biologist and environmental engineer that the tribe hired who was Filipino and was 100% comfortable with being adopted into the sort of indigenous family. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like how does that work, right? And I was just so fascinated because he was actually kind of hired by the tribe, amongst other things. He did all these native plant surveys. He was like working with the tribe on developing like a sort of biodiesel strategy as a like tribal sovereignty mechanism, all this stuff that was like so entangled in the sort of like very mission of indigeneity. And I was like, what is that like to do that as an outsider? And it was so odd to me. So we kind of lost touch. And then once COVID started, I was just thinking about him and like how different our stances had been. So I got in touch with him and asked if we could just like have a Zoom chat about this. And yeah, he was very fully of the mindset that if you are doing sort of indigenous directed work on indigenous projects and all of this, that it was possible to belong in those communities. Okay. And I kept asking questions and questions and questions and questions. And I was like, I don't think it changed my mind, but what it did get me thinking about is that the Philippines also have a long history of colonization. So, I think we tend to think about like Asian Americans and like one big lump, right? So for him, I think it was like, okay, so you go from being like indigenous to the Philippines and kind of occupying that similar spot in the sort of like configuration of cultural politics in the Philippines. And then you end up in rural Idaho. And it's like, well, who are your clear allies in that configuration? So for him, that was a natural fit. Whereas for me, coming from a nationalist Chinese family, but then like nationalists in Taiwan were viewed as violent, external, like colonial wave. It's a much more complicated history of what my own diasporic history looks like. And with that double consciousness of sorts as like colonizer, colonized, it's kind of impossible to say, oh, okay, like I'm going to like move into the comfort of this other space where maybe I would be accepted.
Different level of access. It's like of affiliation or some sort of social or political access to like being adopted, I guess. There's some comfort in that. Like you feel a little safe, like you're being protected, especially I guess working for the tribe too. You feel like you should be on the same team to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I have no problem with the way that he identified. I like, the reason I wanted to talk with him about it is because I envy it. I'm obsessed with these questions of like, well, where do you draw the line? And how is it that some people can quote unquote indigenize? I mean, I think he did it in a way that I'm like, oh, that's the dream that a lot of people have, right? And for most people, it's like, no, that's not a good dream. That's a very transgressive dream. And you don't try to do that. But, I mean, it's like very able botanist, but I would not say that his botanical skills are the reason why he belongs there, right? I think it had a lot more to do with sort of like shared activism and sort of understanding the vision of tribal sovereignty and contributing to it.
Yeah, I've thought about this myth or this, it's been thrown around a little bit like we're all indigenous to some place. Have you heard that before? It's like how kind of shitty that is, or how like, and then that's just like ends the conversation. We're like, yep. Yeah, I guess you're right. So just having a connection, I guess, to where you came from, I feel like helps you be a little grounded. But my history is a settler history and not like one of an immigrant, really, right? It wasn't like my family wasn't displaced. We weren't refugees from like the potato famine in Ireland. We were like Protestant. So, Protestant Irish, so they had certain levels of access to certain things, moving to New York and then actually to like the Great Lakes region and like fought in the Revolutionary War and then received land for that service and like all those things that kind of come along with that. So that's like one arc of my family history that I have. And then we ended up here again, settled in the San Juan Islands because the United States was claiming that territory, that 45th parallel. So right before Washington became a state, which I always growing up, we've been here a long time, but it's really not that long.
Yeah. I think there's this like tug, like that kind of family history like connects us to a place. And I think there like is this notion that we all have some sort of ground that we like could call our own or sort of like inhabit or care for in this really authentic way, right? So there's kind of a body of theory around like, okay, so we have like settlers, we've got the colonizers, and we've got the colonized, right? There's some people who are like, okay, well then where do immigrants fit? And this sort of efforts to say, okay, we're going to disrupt those dialectics. We're not going to have the colonizer and the colonized by themselves. We're going to have this third term, right? Like maybe like some people call it the alien or something, right? Where you're not indigenous, you're not a settler, but you're here now, having a range of effects in the environment. And then there's people who have pushed back against that and said, well, you're still a colonizer, right? And you can come here on terms that aren't ideal and still be a colonizer, right? And I think I do agree with that as well, right? So it's kind of like, well, any philosophical approach is limited, right? And dialect is kind of described as sort of tension and like a certain kind of self-feeding relationship between like two things. And when you step into that mix in the settler colonial balance, like you play a role. Not to say there aren't other dialectics, right? Like immigrant, indigenous dialectics or this or that. But if we're just looking at settler colonialism, I think a lot of immigrants probably, if I were to take a long, hard look at my family's history, I would say, oh, we're colonizers. Being not white is not an exemption from being a colonizer in these contexts. Yeah. But I do think that there's, you trace your family's history back, you can find it in a book. I cannot trace the history on my father's side back. I mean, in that case, it's a very perhaps willful disruption. My grandpa was a nationalist. His brothers were all communists, right? Giant family feud, blood oath to like never get in touch with that side of the family again. And a few generations down the line, like that still has never happened. I don't even know the people anymore. No one in the family would facilitate it. Like that side of the history is a closed book, even to someone as sort of historically minded as me. And if I were to pursue that, I think my family would be really pissed.
Sometimes I think with this mobile recorder, it has some power, and some days I'm going to take some time away from the podcast and go just shove the recorder in the face of my aunt and uncles and people. If it's not written down, maybe we can digitize it somehow, So as people pass on, you lose contiguity, I guess, of your family history. You did bring me back to what you reminded me that Jessica Hernandez, I was going to ask, I think I might ask her, maybe so you don't have to answer, but we'll ask her. Just as a transnational indigenous woman, thinking about her place in this area as a guest, like you can either be, I guess, an unwelcome guest or a welcome guest, right? So maybe it's that kind of that in-between place that you were talking about. Does that make sense?
I think for me, I would say the same. Like when we first started talking about this, you were like, "Oh, so you're from Idaho," and that is where my storytelling heart resides, right? Yeah. It's I lived there from when I was 3 until when I was 17. It's a chunk, but not the majority of my life there. But the whole time I was in California, I think I never felt at home. I've always felt that tug back towards rural Idaho. Even now, I'm always trying to get my parents to visit, and they're like, you do know that that's like super far. We have to go over the Cascades, and it's winter. And to my mind, I think I just erase that distance, and I'm like, oh, I'm home. But when I think about what that home is, it's Idaho. I love it there, and for me, I think it's because it is an area I know well. I sort of like love its like geomorphological mythology, right? The sort of like volcanic, loess-covered hills of the Palouse, and this ephemerality of the whole thing. It's a place that's the mythology that I grew up with, and I think it's just really kind of lodged in my heart. So moving to Tacoma is interesting because people have been like, have you settled in? Is it home to you? And I'm kind of like, I don't know. I just got tenure on Wednesday. I could be here till I'm 70, which I'm like, well, if I did that, if I lived here till I was 70, would this be home? I'm not actually sure that it would be, which of course has got me thinking long and hard about like, well, what makes Idaho home? I didn't like it there. The reason I was there until I was 17 was because I graduated a year early and left as quickly as I could for a lot of reasons that have to do with race and the craziness of rural Idaho, so why is it stuck with me in that way?
You still feel like a little tether, like a little orbit, you're still kind of orbiting around it somehow?
And it is the landscapes. Like that's where I learned to backpack. That's where I first started learning about like plants. That's a place, where I just have all of these memories. Like the Sawtooth. I remember the first time my parents took us on a trip to the Sawtooth and I was asleep and I just got out of the car and was like, what is this,
My son does that now. We'll take a car trip and he's like in his iPad, and then all of a sudden like 3 hours later he's like, what? There's like no trees around, and all of a sudden we're just like, where the heck are we? And he's like totally discombobulated. It's different now.
Yeah. No, I love that. Something I think about with my kids too. Like maybe I'm too deliberate about like we must take them all of these places and do all these things, but I'm really keenly aware that like my sense of where I belong doesn't really lie in those family histories or anything. It's in like these connections with the landscape. But what do you do when you have all of these connections? Every memory of like home, I would say, is northern Idaho. But at the same time, I mean, I grew up less than 30 miles from the Nez Perce Reservation without having a good understanding of what it meant to be Indigenous, like in the land that I called home, without understanding the patchwork reservation and how much of that land had been stolen in some really nefarious ways by white settlers, right? And that sort of awareness of like, oh, right? Like headed out along Route 12, that stretch of highway between Idaho and Montana, like that is the country I dream about, you know, like that's where I learned how to backpack. Those are the mountains that I loved. All the years I was in California, like that's the place that called me home. And then being like, oh, like that is Indigenous land, and Indigenous land that was like really not recognized as such, right? I think one of the things that I say that coming to work at Northwest Indian College really reshaped my land ethic. And part of that was because right when I started working there, do you remember the whole megaloads thing? Like heavy machinery that some oil companies wanted to move through Route 12, and they needed a permit from the Forest Service, and the Forest Service was required to consult with the tribe, but then they didn't consult with the tribe, and they issued the permit without their consent, and then everyone flipped out, and the tribe like barricaded the highway, and a bunch of like tribal elders and stuff got arrested.
Sounds like pretty not an uncommon scenario, of not consultation and then kind of some resistance.
Oh, yeah. And it was kind of like Route 12. And so that stretch of river, it's a wild and scenic river along the Lochsaw, like headed into Montana. It's a sportsman's paradise, right? Which is how I had always thought of it. And I hadn't really understood it as this corridor of like vulnerable land where all of this like heavy machinery, like can you carry toxic waste down that? Can you carry these like huge vehicles that like barely fit on the road? I hadn't really understood the heated battles over that road as just sort of like one of the like central corridors through Indigenous land. So I think kind of stepping into those dynamics changed everything for me. And I just had this sense of like, how could I possibly have grown up loving this place so much without a sense of any of this? Yeah, actually, I think what was in the back of my mind in the High Country news piece that you read, I guess that like brings us here today. And it didn't find its way into that story very deeply. But that first year that I was working at Northwest Indian College, I just finished teaching one day and it was like really pretty weather and stuff, and I was like, oh, you know, like there's Chinese graveyard like up on the high prairie, just extremely important Nez Perce land, like up on the Camas Prairie, and it's beautiful, and you just kind of cross across the Clearwater River and then just like head up, and then all of a sudden the land opens up. So I was like, oh, I'm going to drive out there and I'm going to find the Chinese graveyard. And so that trip somehow was like, I don't know, because it was just one of those like beautiful days that you just like remember as like one of your moments in nature, right? But it was also extremely weird. I got to the town, this little town called Pierce, where the graveyard supposedly is, but it's like hard to find. And I think someone decided to play a prank on me because they saw me wandering around. I think they probably thought I was some kind of intruder. I didn't belong there. So then we had a little chat and they were like, oh, go talk to so-and-so at the bar. He knows all the natural history, he'll show you. So I'm like, oh, whatever, that's part of my little voyage, right? Like I'll like go to the bar, have a drink, like swap some old tales with the bartender. I say that in that tone of voice because, you know, that's kind of like, I don't know what a journalist or what a storyteller would have done. I think I made it till probably about 30 years old thinking that I was like a white man. Like, I know that sounds ridiculous, right? But a lot of my mentors were like white writers, white scientists, like white outdoorsmen. This was my world, you know? I just thought of myself as a total tomboy and like someone who was in those environmental worlds that were all white. I did not give it a second thought. I did not fear for my safety. I like walked in, I like ordered a beer and started asking questions.
It's seriously like, it reminds me of like walk the walk, talk. If you can like manifest it like that, you can fit in, I guess.
Well, he poured me one beer and then told me I needed to leave because he moved to Pierce because he didn't want to see faces like mine because I reminded him of Korea. So then I had this like weird moment of like beginning to be like, but I'm not Korean, and then it was just like not the point. That's not the point. Like I just need to get out of here because Pierce is the kind of place where you probably, suddenly like dawned on me, and my lovely day was over at that point, right?
That generation's multicultural experiences were shaped by the sort of experience during war. It just like really impacts the way they see the world. Trauma associated with it that just continues.
And those are such complicated dynamics. Yeah. And actually, Anna Lone helps sing like in The Mushroom at the End of the World. Do you know that book? Mm-mm. Oh my gosh. Okay, like look up that book. And she actually has this really cool digital project. It's called Feral Atlas. But The Mushroom at the End of the World is about matsutakis and the way that they grow on disturbed terrain in this sort of invasive conversation we're having. Like she's definitely someone who shaped my thinking, right? This species, like it grows in disturbed habitat, like under these young pines, oftentimes, so disturbed land, logged land, but the ways that this kind of interacts with Japanese and other Asian cultures and like Asian foragers, like immigrant foragers coming to that because they're really valuable mushrooms. You can earn far more than you could in like lots of, jobs on the West Coast. And then she has a section as well about veterans there's a whole like a veteran community who falls into this foraging lifestyle and the way that these dynamics kind of play out in the Oregon woods. It's really, really a cool book. But yeah, there's certainly like all sorts of trauma and tension that, we butted heads in that moment. But another part of me was like, well, what did I think was happening? The reason that there's an Asian graveyard is because there was a situation in which like a bunch of Asian miners got lynched and then had to be buried. And so I'm like, well, like, maybe not that much has changed. And it was silly of me to think that I could like drive up here alone and have a beer and exchange yarns about history. And, no, that's not how that place works. I think this part did find its way into that High Country News story a little bit. The actual tree where, I guess it's sort of like recent mythology, the actual like hanging tree is a historical monument, and a Boy Scout troop recently went and improved it. But it's very odd because it's celebrated history with no sense of how messed up it is, right?
Like we need to preserve the history of that for some reason, like some sort of artifact.
No, didn't ask. I just left. But it's just so interesting to me, like all of these sort of layers on the landscape, right? So, and then there's this other part of me that's just sort of like, well, so working for the Nez Perce tribe for so long and in environmental management capacities, like I so valued the opportunity to learn indigenous plants, oftentimes from my students. I value that history. I value those names. And then I have this question of my history in America, or my family's history in Taiwan, or all these things are like colonizer histories, right? But in northern Idaho, the history of the Chinese is one of persecution as well, right? So like, where's the language for that, right? Or like, what do I do with like my sense of like when I think about those high prairies? And for me, it's like tangled up with that whole extremely weird day. It's also tangled up. I avidly read the complete Lewis and Clark's diaries, like the edited by Bernard DeVoto. So I forget whether it was Lewis or Clark, but getting to the Camas Prairie and thinking that they had reached the Pacific Ocean. And like the deception was so complete that at first I thought it was water. I don't know why, like it just line like jumped out of the diaries like a line of poetry for me. So when I encounter those Camas Prairies, it's all of these things, right? It's Lewis and Clark. It's the time that I spent with the Nez Perce tribe, the history of Chinese Americans in Idaho. So I think when it comes to all of that, I've just sort of been like less and less interested with like, well, what do we call the plants? And more interested in like other kinds of storytelling. But then in individual conversations, I'm frequently like, I don't have any words, right? Like I was trying to say salmonberry, and I'm like, do I say salmonberry? Or, especially here, we have so many indigenous languages kind of clustered so close together. What is the word? What are the words we use to talk about these things when there are so many words? and as a non-Indigenous person, which Indigenous word gets preference,
Yeah.
and the very idea that we should allocate the word to like one tribe when so many tribes use the land. We take a very colonial approach to deciding how to use Indigenous language. You're still being a total colonizer in the way that you're using that.
I dropped in on your webinar the other day with Washington Native Plant Society. It was really intense. Salmonberry played a bit of a fixture in the talk. I don't know if it's worth exploring this discussion within the Washington Native Plant Society. I don't want to throw a lot of shade at them, but I feel like to a certain extent it is like a little microcosm of a world where they draw this distinction. They value this nativeness, and their Facebook group kind of imploded or exploded, I guess, like last year, right?
Yeah, did you watch that happen in real time as well?
Sometimes I take breaks from Facebook, and I think I just missed it. I heard about it, and then subsequently folks told me about it, and I think in some parallel group, there's a whole Facebook world, and so in some other Facebook groups, they were talking about what happened, and so I heard it third hand, I guess.
Yeah, so basically, I saw it from sort of the beginning. Someone in that group called Salmonberry a thug. Basically like, well, how do I remove it to make room for my real native plants? And then some people objected to that, I think very rightfully so. And then more people started doubling down on, but Salmonberry is a thug, and here are all of these other native plants, especially other members of the Rubus genus, that are also thugs. And then people who seemed like they weren't talking about plants at all, but I don't know if they're like trolls or they had some reason for being in a Native Plant Society Facebook group, right? Started like making these posts that seemed like white nationalist inflammatory posts in that space. So it was actually a really interesting experience, right? Watching that escalation for how easily like our native plant rhetoric could be broadened into really racist language. So that was fascinating for me. And to the degree that I want to throw some shade at the Washington Native Plant Society, they eventually decided to kind of deal with the conflict by erasing the threads. And to me, that was not optimal because I think they were worried because there were some really, really offensive things that got said and they just wanted it to go away. And I think that it would have been worthwhile for them to reflect on how that happened and how some of the ways that we talk about plants invite that sort of overt racism, right? Like that wasn't an accident. So yeah, that's my take on what happened. I wish that those threads had stayed around as soon as, so an alternate group broke off and formed, and I joined that other group and then just said, hey, I think I want to write about this, like dropped them a link and was like, here's the kind of writing I do, send me your screenshots. So I have all the screenshots.
You kind of crowdsourced all the screenshots.
Yeah. So if someone had been like, nah, that didn't happen, I would have been like, I have the receipts. Like, do you really want me to like put that up here? I did have that information. When I gave that talk, I was like, my goal with this is not to call people by name. It's to understand how the rhetoric of native plants is actually to some degree the rhetoric of white supremacy, right? And to see how easy it was to escalate from one to the next. We have this tendency to like to shut that down and be like, no, like those people aren't us, those people are just trolls or whatever it is. But I don't think that's the case. It's by and large the same philosophy. So I really hope that people will reflect on that a little bit more.
And this is so deep. I mean, we could go talk for another hour about this. I see it too. I do feel, again, like a traitor, or I feel like a conspiracy theorist. But I think you're right here along with me to a certain extent, just like how there's actually a meeting tomorrow, the Washington State Noxious Weed Board, right? So there's this whole state system or sort of apparatus that names things that don't belong as weeds or invasive species as threats or that do harm to us. We'll say us. And we don't mean everybody, us. But then, too, there's this system, really, of, like, surveilling and policing these plants, just like we talked about with this tree of heaven out here outside my door. And it's very much, I want to say, distinct. But now that you just said this, like, it's the same, right? It's, like, very much the same system of putting people in prisons and, like, categorizing certain people as criminals. And the sort of apolitical language we often use is, like, surveying or monitoring or controlling scrolling, or this very technocratic or apolitical language, which very much has impacts on the real world.
And is also the kind of apolitical language that we use to talk about the way that we surveil populations of actual people. So, I mean, it is politicized language, even if we don't want it to be.
I mean, I was on an email, something in my inbox. I was looking today because I was looking for examples. And I had this email thread with this subject line, real-time weed location map. So,
oh my gosh.
It's like so like high tech, right? And it's like, this is my life. So we have the ability and I could show you on this laptop back here. Someone has a mobile device out there and is like, poison hemlock here, garlic mustard here. Yeah. And it's like, in real time, we're trading information and making plans to like extinct these things from the landscape. So that's where this sort of language, the origins of thoughts, it's just all wrapped into this very real implications or real time like action on the land.
And that can be such a quagmire as well, right? Because so often that kind of tool comes from citizen science. And I think that's so cool that I can download an app on my phone and I can contribute to a science project. I can be out there and be like, there's like this weed and this weed and this weed and this weed. When people paint that kind of citizen science as this like awesome intervention, this democratization of science, a way of making it so that all of us can go out and make a difference. And I think it's really sketchy if you think about the sort of surveillance implications of that. And so it's just kind of like, well, I'm really not sure like how, all of these things that I care about come into conflict with each other. And that makes it so hard to know how to proceed. And, I think sometimes I ask myself, I'm like, why, out of all of the things that I have almost done with my life, have I just become a broke writer? Why did this seem like the correct path? Why did this seem like the correct or inevitable path through existence, right? And, I think, in large part, like, I really am convinced that at least for me, like those tools aren't really the answer. And having like people who synthesize these complicated stories about how things that oftentimes seem good have these really complicated problems associated with them. I think that's so important. Like ultimately, I don't mean to poo-poo citizen science. I don't mean to poo-poo the Native Plant Society. I think all of these are like ways that people develop like sincere and important relationships with nature. I hope people can also understand that each of these mentalities also comes with some costs and like have some like open-hearted conversations about what those costs might be.
Yeah. When we think of like policy and change and how we change this, I know that this weed board meets tomorrow. Maybe they meet monthly, maybe they meet quarterly. Who are these people? They're essentially kind of similar to the WMPS crowd, right? They're like native plant or weed geeks. And they're kind of a very elite group, even though it's a state organization, not a lot of transparency. Again, like a little like deep state conspiracy theory in my brain. They are public. No one really attends these meetings. It was like at the King County Noxious Weed Board meeting, a listing, they renew the list every year. It was like me and Celeste were there like a month ago, and we were the only ones there to give feedback or comments. The rest of the public I don't feel like they care because these bodies that make the decisions are just so removed from reality in my mind. And they're making the rules, and then they're decentralizing this control or surveying, monitoring, and control out to the citizen, like an app that people contribute to via citizen science. I'm so overwhelmed by it, but
yeah. I mean, best case scenario, it seems like fiddling while Rome burns. Like, I really think we're like, in an accelerating climate catastrophe. And I'm like, can we please diminish our use of fossil fuels and prepare to adapt to whatever is coming next?
Yeah, and again, I think of that too. I was like, oh, my tax dollars at work, right? And it's like, why are we spending this on like, can't we fund jobs somewhere else or something, like that? I think out on the coast, there's some like new green, I should know this, like green crab or something that's invasive. And it's kind of moving in on the shellfish industry. I think of some of which that some of the tribes rely on. And a lot of people think that we can like eat our way out of it. So it's like, well, these species are invasive. I know you don't like the taste of green crab, but we can acquire a taste for it, and then we'll just eat our way out of this, problem. So that is problematic as well. So people think like, oh, we can just eat all the garlic mustard, or like we can train people to eat all the knotweed, and then because we don't want it, we can just eradicate it that way.
A smidge of truth to that, but obviously we're not eating all of it. But one of the weird things about writing about invasive species is that my email has become inundated with people like sending me things
like
about
me. I'm so
species.
sorry. Yeah,
being like, check out this invasive spider, like check out this invasive tree, check out this, and I'm just sort of like, oh my gosh, like there are so many things happening that are painted as like full-on invasions. And I'm just sort of like, well, there's no stopping this. Like maybe we shine like the light on like one invasive species at a time, right? But this is what is happening in our country now in a way that like we're going to have a minimal ability to fix, I think. So I think it really becomes a question. I mean, to the extent that we try to fix it, I think it seems like a lot of what you're implying in your comments is that we're devoting our attention to plants that affect agribusiness, right? To the extent that we're doing this at all, whose interests are we protecting and why? And I think it's like totally reasonable to say like, hey, let's protect tribal fisheries or tribal oyster farming before we protect other interests. Like, absolutely. I'm not saying we should be against that all of the time, but I think we should be thinking about to what degree are we going to maintain this indigenous versus invasive ideology while we're doing that? Would it be more honest to have a conversation about the way that we are managing some species in order to promote other kinds of agriculture, sort of ecological services approach to it, right? But part of me is like, well, maybe that would be a more transparent conversation that didn't involve all of these sort of lingering racialized valencies in the same way.
I think that might be a good place to end it for now. I know it's like kind of open-ended. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm so grateful you came over to the studio. Where can people, do you want people to email you random stuff about invasive species? Or where can people find out more about you and your work?
One of the hard things about having a Chinese name is it makes it very hard to give people my email address because it's Chinese words. But my email address is jennyliou@gmail.com. So that's JennyHwayuLiou @gmail.com. And I love getting emails from people who want to talk about plants.
Awesome. Sorry, just one last thing. Did I hear you had a book coming out? Did you say that out loud? Is that a thing?
I have a couple books coming out.
Couple?
So the way that this kind of unfolded was that I have a collection of poetry that's coming out with Kaya Press. It was supposed to be out very soon. Now, printing delays. It'll be out in the fall.
Okay.
And Kaya Press is a publisher of Asian diasporic literature. It's like my dream press. So I was really excited about the poetry book going there. But then when the High Country News article came out, they asked me if I wanted to write about that, since it is very much about immigrant environmentalism and the Asian diaspora. So I shared my book ideas with them. They decided that it should be split into 2 books. That means there's 3 books on the way, a poetry collection that'll be out soon, and then the one that's probably more exciting to environmentally minded folks will be coming out, who knows when? 2023? They're on the way.
I'm so proud for you. I don't know, it's so awesome. 3 books on the way.
Yeah,
That's great.
It's been an interesting ride there for sure.
Cool.
All right.
Well, thanks for being on the podcast. Okay.
All righty. Let's go get our kids.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Treehugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Jenny Liou. She can be reached through her website linked in the show notes. It takes a community to keep the podcast going. I am totally independent and you can donate to help cover the small overhead for the show. Add Yadrick via PayPal and Venmo and Cash App at Michael Yadrick Jr. Next on Treehugger Podcast, I bring you a discussion with Dr. Jessica Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. Her work is grounded in her Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. Her first book, Fresh Banana Leaves, just published earlier this year. Here's a snippet of that chat.
So one of the things that I am researching is how in physics, right, energy is taught as an abstract concept. It was created during the British Industrial Revolution, but yet there's a lot of disconnections between the concept of energy and the social political implications it has in our current society. Even when we look at renewable energy, right, we think that that's the best way to go forward. But in many Indigenous communities, especially on my lands, renewable energy is actually displacing our people, and it's actually leading to more environmental degradation, especially like when we look at dams and how they're impacting our rivers and our livelihoods. And then we look at mining companies and all these other extractive energy sources as well. So looking at that intersection.
The archive of this episode also lives online at treehuggerpod.com. Treehugger Podcast is on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show, or tell a friend about the show. The music for the show you heard from DJ Freedom, Chris Haugen, and DJ Williams. One can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the weeds.